by talking about science and medicine and evolution and the ways that these things interact and how they are understood by many people in these fields and by the public generally. And this was prompted by, there's an op-ed published in Stat on the 24th of this month, so that'll be yesterday, called Fixing U.S. Public Health Will Require a Health Systems Revolution and for Physicians to Take a Backseat. Wow, that's so... The headline is, I'm going to read that with the right intonation, Fixing U.S. Public Health Will Require a Health Systems Revolution and for Physicians to Take a Backseat. So the same author published a similar piece in The Nation, which, if you just want to show my screen here for a moment, this is, again, same author, Eric Reinhardt. This was published a couple days earlier on February 22nd, also this week, which is called Want to Fix Public Health, Stop Thinking Like a Doctor. Public health requires seeing the world from a collective perspective, but U.S. agencies are still dominated by doctors trained to work on an individual level. So I want to first share a couple of paragraphs from this piece that strike me as, well, let me just share a couple paragraphs first. And you can, again, show my screen if you like, Zach. This is a PDF, but it's exactly, it's the Nation article that came out this week by a guy named Eric Reinhardt in a section that he calls The Hazards of Clinicism. When we treat patients, doctors are appropriately oriented around taking care of the individual in front of us. So I should say that the author is an MD. When we treat patients, doctors are appropriately oriented around taking care of the individual in front of us. We recognize that we typically cannot change their life circumstances, such as economic and housing conditions, employers' demands, student and medical debt, neighborhood violence, or social isolation, and so we focus our clinical attention on helping them live as well as possible within existing constraints. Public health, by contrast, is about treating populations. As with medicine, the goal of public health is to enable individuals to be free of health limitations that curtail their ability to live as they please. But public health pursues this by very different means. The task is not to help individuals accommodate to oppressive social or labor contexts. It is instead to use the power of government to change conditions that are constraining people's freedom. The core tools of public health, then, are not just vaccines or lab tests, but also policies pertaining to corporate regulation and consumer safety standards, labor protections, public jobs and housing programs, investments in community health workers, decriminalization and decarceration, and civil rights lawsuits. Okay, so you can hear my screen back here. Let me just, one sentence in particular there jumped out at me. So far, like this seems broadly correct, the arguments here. He says the role of public health is instead to use the power of government to change conditions that are constraining people's freedom. Yes. I'm surprised to hear that from someone who is arguing for what amounts to a curtailing of greater freedoms. That we had so much during the last 3 years that amounted to, in order to get your lives back, you're going to need to give us some of what you've got. In order to be healthy, in order to be safe, in order to, then it went to, in order to keep grandma healthy, in order to keep the children healthy, in order to keep grandma healthy, or grandma safe and the children safe, then we're going to need to curtail what it is that you're allowed to do. Take some things away. Don't worry, we'll give them back later, unless we don't. And this has been the direction for 3 years, and the argument here would seem to be that the problem has been too much of a focus on the individual and not enough on the population, and that seems to me to be indicative of having lived on a kind of a different planet for the last 3 years.
Let's fix it.
Okay,
because I know exactly what's being alleged here, and my sense is so far what they've said in principle is at least not wrong, but the problem is the in principle.
It's a he. It's not a they.
It is a. I will get back to defending why it is a they later, because although it is authored by a he, it is speaking for something else, I believe. But the issue is here one of net freedom, right?
Yep.
It is not one of instantaneously measured freedom. The argument, which was persuasive to many at the beginning of the pandemic, was that in order to control the spread of the virus and therefore free us from it later, we needed to give up freedoms in the present. That turned out to be horseshit, right? It's not even obvious that the people who were handing down these policies were interested in us controlling the pandemic. They exploited it for other reasons, and that is a terrifying story. But nonetheless, there's nothing wrong with the idea that one gives up some freedoms now in order to have greater freedoms later. One surrenders to the TSA and to the authority of those on an airplane in order to have the freedom to go to some far-off place, ashwagandha or somewhere else, in order to see something they've never seen before. So anyway, the point is, trading a reduction in freedom now in order for greater freedom later is a perfectly rational argument to make. And certainly it is true that public...
It can be a perfectly rational argument.
It is not inherently a rational argument in any place, but there's nothing irrational about making such an argument. It is not a non sequitur.
Yeah.
And I will say that public health, if it were to function, is about this very thing. There is a conflict between the individual level of health and the collective level of health that can result in a paradoxical, if you free the individual, it reduces the freedom of individuals on a much larger scale.
This is true, but it seems to me that the argument hinges, that Reinhardt's argument, and yes, it is a bigger they that he is speaking for, right? Hinges on the idea that practitioners of medicine and science throughout the pandemic, including, and he calls out Fauci and Walensky, actually, it's interesting that we are now arriving there, right? That he calls out basically the heads of organizations that helped make policy that many people are finally beginning to recognize was terrible, almost across the board. I would say across the board, but many people are coming to realize that it was at least many more of these decisions were bad than many people believed at the time. He thinks that this is because that these were individual scientists pursuing individual, things that were good for individuals. And my argument, of course, and our argument has been for almost 3 years, that's not the problem here. That's not what went wrong. What went wrong, in part, is that science actually wasn't being done. That there were a lot of the sort of markers of science. There was even Fauci declaring that he was science, and there were credentials, and there were papers that looked really sciencey, and when you went into them, they had lots of numbers in them, and all of this. But it wasn't actually a scientific approach to understanding what was going on. And let me just one more little excerpt here before we get back to how else you wanted to fix these first two paragraphs that I read. This is actually from the paragraph just before in that same Nation op-ed that I just read. And you can show my screen if you want to, Zach, but you don't have to. He writes, physician and public health scholar Milton Romer once observed that for the work of public health, quote, most of medical education is irrelevant. But neither doctors' irrelevant medical knowledge nor relative ignorance of essential fields, labor history, social anthropology, political economy, epidemiology, environmental sciences, is the most troubling aspect of physician control of public health. Rather, it's the lack of epistemic humility, conferring an inability to recognize the limits and hazards of clinical reasoning, with which medical training often imbues them. Clinical reasoning is not only not the population-level logic of public health, it is frequently antithetical to it. So this, to me, perfectly encapsulates the problem with the conversation that we have been having, that we have been trying to have publicly, and that so many people, so many of the talking heads, both in and outside of medicine, that are effectively, making or enforcing the public policy that's being handed down to us, is making. First of all, look at the list of things that he thinks need to be included. Labor history, social anthropology, political economy, epidemiology, environmental sciences. Where's evolution? And we'll talk a little bit more maybe before I get into this, but what I want to talk about ultimately here, why this is coming up, is that nowhere in any of these conversations is evolution actually showing up. And what we have been doing for our entire careers, but publicly for almost 3 years now, is revealing why having an evolutionary understanding of the world you're in and how complex that means the complex systems that you're engaging, of and with must be, can actually help you make informed decisions about your life and the lives of your loved ones, and help you be healthier and more productive going forward. So he's attacking the clinical reasoning of Walensky and Fauci. And what I would say is we have seen no evidence of clinical reasoning from them or from the vast majority of doctors who have been in lockstep with things like mandates and definitely avoiding any kind of effective treatment, and things like putting patients on ventilators, as we talked about last week on Dark Horse. This isn't about a failure of clinical reasoning, this isn't about the limits of clinical reasoning to solve public health problems. That may also be true. Like, the fields that he mentions, labor history and political economy, are relevant to a question of how is it, if you're a doctor and a patient comes in and you can tell that their diet is crap, but they live in a food desert and there's no way for them to get good food, what can you do for them? Right? Like, what you can't exactly tell them you need to start eating, steak and avocado if they have no access to steak and avocado. Right? So that is a problem. And that is a conflict, a tension between individual level health practitioners and a society where public health is actually in all of our interest. But the problem with the COVID response was actually deeper, bigger, and more fundamental than what he is talking about here. It was a complete failure to think logically, rigorously, scientifically, and in any way evolutionarily at basically every single level. And time again, we got told, stay in your lane. It's like, you know what? If vaccinology and epidemiology and virology and, on and on and on and on, and medical science and all of these things are failing because they are so specialized that they can't tell what is going on. And we are coming in with a generalist paradigm that is evolutionary analysis, and it is time and time and time again able to predict what is going to happen next. Well, then maybe everyone in all of these fields ought to be getting some background and experience in thinking evolutionarily, and we would all be better off.
I hate to disagree with you.
Do you?
Yes, but I've got to take you to task. You're being far too generous. In other words, it's worse than that.
No.
And I want to resurrect an idea. Some may have heard me invoke it before. It's originally a cybernetic idea, but it is so fundamentally important that it belongs squarely in the center of this discussion.
Okay.
It is posywid. The purpose of a system is what it does. Okay. And what this says is it doesn't matter.
Posywid?
Posywid, yeah.
Purpose of system is what it does.
Right.
It's an acronym.
Right. What it means is I don't care what that object claims to be doing. I don't even care what the people who built the object think it does. The purpose of the object is what it does. And the reason that this is so important is evolutionary, which is that sometimes even a system that is architected well for a particular purpose, if you build the right characteristics into it, will evolve into something else. And nobody changes the label on it. They assume it does what it always did. So my point is going to be the purpose of our public health system is apparently to override doctors and inflict dangerous treatments on people that are profitable. I don't know why that's the case or how anybody allowed it to become the case, but it is demonstrably the case. It is the reason that we had a system, and this is the place that I know you know this, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but the reason that I'm going to push back a little bit is that I don't think this was a failure of our system. This was the success of an undeclared system that overrode the system we're supposed to have that's supposed to protect the public health.
That's quite possible. I feel like they're all related conversations. But the point that I'm trying to make here with regard to Reinhardt, who, as far as I know, I don't know who he is. As far as I know, is trying to make an argument about the collective versus the individual levels of analysis, and he is making a claim that science failed us. That what has been revealed for the last 3 years is that science can't get you there, and what we have been saying for 3 years is no. You haven't tested that hypothesis yet because science wasn't done here. we need actual science. We need to actually do science.
And I want to recover the idea that this is really a they giving voice to a perspective through an individual who has authored this wrong-headed piece. But I want to point out, when we spoke last week about the value, what is produced by science being models that are robust enough to extrapolate from, I want to point out that the idea that we are giving voice to here in a medical context has a famous quote that our audience is very likely to know from a totally different context, from a totally different source, an absolutely non-medical source. And that is Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell says, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Okay? Now, what that means is that, why is he saying that? He's saying that because he is interfacing with a complex system. And the point is, if you're interfacing with a complex system, you either get this most fundamental point, or you're going to be, making infantile mistakes until you get it, because it's the baseline. If you've got a functional complex system, then the point is you probably don't know nearly enough about the consequences of the intervention you naively think is going to improve things.
Yeah. Which
then brings us to this question about, and really the title of that piece, right? Doctors taking a back seat. Now, here's the thing. Public health is the recognition that there are trade-offs between the individual level and the scaled-up version over a society. That's real. The problem is, how good are we at solving those larger scale problems? And I find it essentially diabolical that they would go after what just happened to us as a demonstration that really we need to double down on public health. Because what they did is they silenced the doctors, right? They silenced the doctors, and they did something in lieu of public health, right? It was pharma corruption that spoke as if it was trying to solve a public health problem that caused so much harm. And what I believe that article is, whether the author knows it or not, and the author may well not know it. The author may just simply be following a signal that something needs to be given voice. But that voice is pharma having captured the system, now trying not to be ushered out the door on the basis of all the harm that was done, saying, well, that wasn't real public health, right? What we really need to do is get rid of those people who screwed up the public health response and do some real public health.
It's interesting that actually in at least one of those two articles by the same author, published within a couple days of each other in Stat and in The Nation, he has pharma corruption and perverse incentives, maybe not named exactly that way, but he calls out pharma, which is exactly, it's part of why I focused on The Nation article. We were long time subscribers to The Nation, and criticism of the role that pharma had in public health was one of the things that I had come to expect from them, and that we have seen from nowhere on the left, for the last 3 years. And finally, we're beginning to get these little intimations, and, it's going to come with some whitewashing and some disappearing of history and some pretending and some lying. And that's some stuff that we're going to try to make sure doesn't happen by those who would like to pretend that they got it right all along. But okay, if The Nation is coming back to its roots, in which it understands that those things that have power will try to protect their power, and therefore you can't take literally all the things that they tell you about what they're doing and why they're doing it, then maybe we can get back to some kind of conversation about what has actually happened.
Well, I've got to tell you, I'm struggling not to be cynical about this, but I take pieces like that one, that at this moment would double down on so-called public health, a system that has just failed in this way. I take them as part of what we have called the middle ground scramble. And the idea is nobody at this moment is going to be taken seriously in any conversation if they don't scold pharma. Right? So the scolding of pharma is obligate in a piece like this in order for pharma to keep its captured entity and to continue to sideline doctors who at the end of the day have to face the patients. And the fact is, medicine has a multi-thousand-year history, right? We have some successes in public health and we have some spectacular failures. COVID is a spectacular failure. And so the idea of sidelining doctors after you've just shut doctors up in an effort to advance the public health agenda, which turned out to be a pharma agenda, which did all of this harm, is absolutely insane. And the excuse is basically well, real communism hasn't ever been tried kind of excuse, right? We have to start public health, right? After we've paid this huge global price. And the answer is no. Can we at least go back to doctors who swear an oath not to harm their patients?